Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining us from European time zones, especially one of our speakers, Michael, who's joining us from London. And welcome to the fourth session of SG Declares and Shares as part of the Construction Declare movement and the chapter that we started in Singapore. Today, we have two prolific speakers in Sarah Ichioka and Michael Pollin, and Schirin Taraz has kindly accepted to be our moderator. In the way of introduction, as if Michael or Sarah needed one. Now, I first met Michael a couple of years ago through Sarah when he kindly talked to us about his beautiful book, Biomimicry in Architecture, which I highly recommend. We're particularly excited that Michael is amongst the initiators of the whole Construction Declare movement in London, so in the UK. We will have our questions, and we invite everyone to get engaged and have your questions to both Sarah and Michael about the Construction Declare movement, as well as the presentation that they make on their upcoming, partly on their upcoming book, which we are really eagerly waiting to see. Now, without further ado, I pass to our dear Schirin to take us through the session, and do please have your questions ready and get engaged with the process. Schirin?
Thank you, Hasim. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the Singapore's Declares and Shares series. Today's webinar is a little bit different from the preceding three in that we have two speakers who will hold a joint presentation. So that means we don't have to be such strict timekeepers as we normally are. So there's approximately 20 minutes allocated to the presentation, which should then allow us ample time for the Q&A after. So as Hasim mentioned just now, do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose any questions that you might come up with in the course of as the discussion and presentation proceeds. Before I formally introduce our speakers today, and before we get to that presentation, I would like to spend 5 minutes briefly talking about the platform on which we're meeting today. So the Global Construction Declares movement, and more specifically our Singapore chapter. There are several reasons why today could be a good opportunity to also briefly reflect on the Construction Declares movement, both for Singapore and beyond. First of all, it's pretty exactly a year since we first launched the Singapore site. Back then with both the architects and the engineers declaration. So first birthday is a good time maybe to look both back and forward to what is to come. Secondly, as Hasim mentioned, one of our speakers today, Michael Pollin, is also the co-initiator of the Architects Declare and Construction Declares in UK, where the initiative started. So he's a representative of the global umbrella organization. And lastly, looking at the attendees today and the people who signed up for this webinar, many of us here today are already part of the movement and as a signatory of one of the declarations, which is great. But others are not yet, and I suspect part of the reasons might be that they are not fitting in the existing categories of sign up. So I wanted to very briefly share with you the screen here to look at, this is where we can do more, and this is where we can do more basically. If you look at the existing, the Construction Declares umbrella website, you will see the countries listed at the bottom. So it's an impressive long list by now of countries that have joined the declaration. You will see us here in Singapore represented both with the architects and the structural engineers, as we had started off from there. In the meantime, the ESD consultants and landscape architects have joined as well, which is fantastic. Now, looking at the UK, for instance, there are further categories here, to mention in particular the contractors, but also the students. So for students who are keen to join, the UK organization already has a link up to the partner organization of the Architecture Education Declares. And another interesting one to look at is Australia, who has managed to set up a declaration for builders. And not only have they set up the declaration, but they have also managed to garner signatures from 199 signatories to date. So 199 construction firms in Australia who commit to their active engagement in their practice to address the climate and biodiversity emergency, which I think is fantastic. So back to what that means for us, what we can do. Those categories that are already set up are very easy to bring to our Singapore chapter as well. All that it takes is 5 founding signatories, and then click on this link here on the Construction Declares umbrella web page to set up. Click here and it will take you to a document that takes you through step by step, gives you all the necessary contact details of someone in the UK from the umbrella organization who will help along the way. Now, of course, setting up new categories is also an option. It's a little bit more challenging, but Singapore has done that before for the ESD consultants, and again, the UK umbrella organization is there to help along the way. So I'd like to urge everyone to use your network and use your professional connections and alliances to grow the movement and to get as many professionals and stakeholders in the built environment involved and committed to active stewardship for sustainable and regenerative practices. Now, beyond signing, because that's not obviously only where things start, beyond signing, we'd also like to encourage everyone to actively use this platform. It's meant to be really an open forum for sharing, for motivating each other, for informing each other, informing a community. So please feel free to suggest events and talks, arrange talks. We've had 3 fantastic sessions so far with speakers both from Singapore and overseas. And we are sure that there's just so much more to share and debate. And so let's, hear from you, and let's, keep the content moving. One thing has or will post, I think she will post maybe in the chat box to email addresses for the contact details within WOHA and web, where you can reach out to the Construction Declare Singapore chapter within our offices. All right, so do use the Q&A boxes as mentioned. Michael and Sarah's book that they will present is being written as we speak. And so therefore do use the opportunity to pose as many questions as possible on the book, also on Construction Declares. And because that way you can still influence something that is very much under development, under construction, so to speak. All right, I said let's keep the content moving, so therefore let me formally introduce our 2 speakers. We've got Sarah Ichioka and Michael Pawlyn. Sarah leads Desire Lines, a strategic consultancy for environmental, cultural, and social impact organization and initiatives. She has been recognized as a World Cities Summit Young Leader, one of the Global Public Interest Design 100, a British Council Claude Duffield Cultural Leadership International Fellow, and an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. She is part of the curatorial team for the Singapore Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture in 2021 and serves on the advisory board of the Milan Triennale 2022, titled Unknown Unknowns. Michael Pawlyn is the founder of the firm Exploration Architecture and a pioneering architect in regenerative design. He is also a writer, and his first book, Biomimicry in Architecture, was its publisher's best-selling title for 4 years in a row. He delivers frequent keynotes on innovation, and his TED Talk has had over 2 million viewings. As mentioned, in 2019, Michael co-initiated the Architects Declare or Construction Declares movement, which has spread internationally and now has over 5,000 companies signed up to addressing the planetary crisis. His work will feature in the forthcoming exhibition, Apocalypse and World Salvation at Zeppelin University in Germany. Together, Michael and Sarah are currently working on a book titled Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency, which they will present to us today. With that, over to you, Michael and Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Schirin, and thank you for involving us today. So I'm going to provide a bit of background, then Sarah will describe the key issues that form the starting point for our book. I will give a summary of the chapters, and then it'll be back to Sarah to conclude. And as already mentioned, the book is still a work in progress. We're at first draft stage now, so we're really keen to hear feedback. Sarah and I have known each other since 2008. That was when I was starting my company, Exploration Architecture, and Sarah was just about to join the Architecture Foundation in London. I had previously spent 10 years with Grimshaw and was part of the core team that designed the Eden project. Sarah helped launch my book and also invited Exploration to put on a solo exhibition of our work at the Architecture Foundation. And we've always met on a regular basis for ideas sharing sessions. And it was at one of these in late 2018 that we found we were in a very similar place in terms of concerns about the state of the environment. Sarah had been studying eco-villages in the United States and civic agriculture in Singapore, both a far cry from the rarefied concerns of elite architecture that her previous work had brought her into contact with. She had recently been on a course led by Robert Gilman. Now, he's an astrophysicist and a pioneer of global intentional communities. And Sarah found that inspiring and also highly motivating, concluding that there's an urgent need for cultural change, but a very low level of implementation. I had been reflecting on 10 years of designing transformative projects that were mostly unbuilt because, as I was repeatedly told, the market's not ready for these solutions yet. So when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their 2018 report, I reread one of my favorite essays. It's by Donella Meadows, and it's called Leverage Points. Now, she was a systems thinker, and in this essay, she argued that because systems are complex, it's not always obvious where to intervene to bring about the change you want. She describes 12 places to intervene in a system in order of priority. The most influential place to apply a lever is at the level of the paradigm or mindset out of which the system behavior emerges. So I decided that I needed to work with other people in trying to change the key paradigms that influence the way the built environment is designed. Around the same time, I met up with a friend of mine, Steve Tompkins, the architect, and discussed how alarmed we both were by the findings of the IPCC report. We also discussed where each of us had agency and how we might use that to change things. Steve's firm, Hal Tompkins, had won the Sterling Prize, and over the course of an evening, we developed a plan to get all the UK Sterling winners to make a joint declaration of action. It soon became clear that the best way to do this was to frame it as a declaration of emergency, and it was launched in May 2019. So both Architects Declare and the book we're talking about today were partly inspired by Donella Meadows, and both are wonderfully energizing collaborations. Architects Declare, Construction Declares has spread to 26 countries now, and thank you to all of you involved in establishing it in Singapore. The book is a dream collaboration that has allowed Sarah and I to do some really deep and urgent thinking about how we can address our planetary emergency. And we're excited to be able to share some of our thoughts with you today. So over to Sarah now.
Thanks, Michael. And it's exciting indeed, especially as I realized last night, this is the first time we're speaking together publicly about this collaborative project. And if you're attending this event, chances are high that you share Michael's and my sense of urgency. Alarming articles have been circulated, meetings have been convened, manifestos have been signed. But have we changed course to avoid ecological and social collapse? Our understanding is that those of us working in the built environment are still far off track. In 2018, only 2 days after the publication of the IPCC report that prompted Michael and Steve to found Architects Declare, the Sterling Prize was awarded to Foster & Partners' new office for Bloomberg in London. In many ways, it's a good scheme with several interesting innovations, but this building, which was claimed to be the world's most sustainable office development, came nowhere near what was required to achieve true sustainability, in the sense of something that could be continued indefinitely without damage to future generations. Despite achieving the highest ever BREEAM rating and having a billionaire philanthropist as a client, the building is still consistent, unfortunately, with a 3 degrees C rise in average global temperatures. The vast majority of new buildings completed today come nowhere near the level of performance achieved by the Bloomberg building. And even practices that are industry leaders in sustainability have told us that no more than 10% of their projects are consistent with the needs of our planetary emergencies. Over the last 50 years, we have lost 2/3 of the animal biomass on the planet. And the IPCC gave us 10 years, now actually fewer than that, to achieve radical reductions of our global greenhouse gas emissions. Disturbances like the wildfire smoke choking the residents of Sydney and my hometown, San Francisco Bay Area, and the eruption of new zoonotic diseases have sounded a belated wake-up call to the privileged classes of the wealthy world, to the human-made dangers that have long before impacted the lives of our brothers and sisters in less insulated places and positions. Yet, despite this wake-up call, when it comes to tangible action, it seems to Michael and me that most of us are still collectively deluding ourselves that tightening up the bolts on the existing paradigms will be sufficient. So many of the solutions we need, ecological economics, participatory planning, the circular economy, and so on, were conceived 4 or 5 decades ago. So in our, when we were crawling around on the floor as babies, yet have only slowly moved towards meaningful mainstream application. Why has their acceptance been so slow, we wondered? Political and business leaders in many countries are doing enough to look as though they're acting, while in reality, their actions are nowhere near the scale of what is required. What difference can built environment practitioners make? The public philosopher Roman Krznaric, who has been a major reference for our thinking about time, is one of the number of thinkers who have recently sought to clarify our view of the present moment by mapping possible future trajectories. Krznaric outlines 3 possible pathways shown here: breakdown, reform, and transformation. While examples of breakdown have been well documented by the author Jared Diamond and others, reform is the more slippery and, to us, worrying pathway to which the majority of the world's government and businesses seem currently committed, in which they implement measures that give the impression of addressing the looming crisis, while in reality only delaying collapse. But we are convinced that we can get on the transformation pathway, but we need much bolder thinking and holistic action than is currently dominant, as Michael will now explain.
Thank you, Sarah. So, as I mentioned, we took inspiration from Donella Meadows' essay, Leverage Points. So each chapter in the book represents an urgent shift that we think is necessary. There are 6 chapters, and I'm going to just briefly outline each of these. So the first chapter, Towards Regenerative Design, this is really explaining why we feel sustainability as currently practiced is flawed. And we found out recently that more than half of humanity's total historical fossil fuel emissions have occurred since 1987. Now, that was the year when the idea of sustainability was launched into the mainstream with the UN report, Our Common Future. So we describe what a regenerative approach would mean for landscapes, cities, buildings, materials, and energy systems. And it's clear that we're a long way from this ideal at the moment, but we're absolutely convinced that it is possible for everything that humans to do to have a net positive impact. So currently, sustainability involves mitigating negatives, and that's just nowhere near enough. We need to get above the line of sort of neutral impact into the realm of having a positive impact. That is the task ahead of us. And it's no exaggeration to say that when we as a global society get to that point, it will be a turning point in civilization. The next chapter, Coevolution with Nature. Well, I can remember around 25 years ago, there were a lot of conferences about defining what the ultimate in sustainability is. We now need to do the same with regenerative design, and that's a very rich area of discussion. It's much more than just an amplified form of sustainability, and it's going to require us to completely rethink our relationship with the rest of the living world. The writer Jeremy Lent has argued that the metaphors we hold have a huge bearing on how we behave. And if we carry on with what he calls a conquest of nature metaphor, seeing nature as something to be plundered for resources and so on, then we're heading in a very dangerous direction. And what we need to do instead is to see ourselves as part of a web of life. One of the key sources for this chapter is the philosopher Freya Matthews, and she makes the case for a deeper philosophy of biomimicry. She refers to an argument put forward by the architect Bill McDonough, who said that if you were, just for the sake of argument, you are a manufacturer of a hair gel, what you should do is you should think about the river that will end up in and ask yourself, what does the river want from the hair gel? Freya Matthews says that's on the right lines, but we actually need to go further and ask ourselves, what does nature want us to want? And in all of these chapters, we describe these bold shifts in terms of what they mean for the built environment. What are the fuller implications of these? Moving on to longer now, Roman Krasnarek is one of the main sources for this chapter, as well as an author called Jay Griffiths, who wrote a fantastic book called Pip Pip. And in this chapter, we look at deep time, cyclical time, and quantitative time. And from a perspective of deep time, it's important to realize that actually humans are a very young species. You know, if the whole history of planet Earth was represented as a calendar year, and you were standing a moment before midnight on New Year's Eve and looking back over the course of the year, you'd find that the first life forms appeared in March. The dinosaurs appeared in early December and disappeared on Christmas Day. Humans appeared 60 seconds ago. The whole of recorded history has flashed past in the last 15 seconds. And in the last 1 second, we've emitted 500 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, it's important with deep time to not just see that as the end point, because that tends to make humans seem like the sort of culmination of evolutionary history. Actually, it's important to project forward as well and think about what we are going to do in the next 1/10 of a second, because that is going to determine whether we will flourish or potentially collapse. And we go on to describe how an understanding of deep time, cyclical time, and qualitative time can help rethink the way we go about building, rethinking the problems of shortening timescales, and really learn to become what Roman Krasnarek calls being a good ancestor. On planetary health, this is a chapter where we're looking into the whole subject of growth. Now, lots of people have observed that endless growth is impossible on a finite planet, and yet our economies are still based on this impossibility. There were pioneers of this thinking like Herman Daly in the 1970s, but because of the dominance of conventional economics, it's only been recently that there's been a lively questioning of this ideology of endless growth. Our conclusion is that donut economics, as pioneered by the economist Kate Raworth, is the clearest new model that reconciles economics with planetary limits. And we also argue that the key purpose that should drive the economy should not be growth or degrowth or even a steady state, but rather the pursuit of planetary health. And that's the idea that our health, our human health, is inseparable from the state and health of our planetary life support systems, the ecosystems that keep us alive. The chapter on symbiosis, now this picks up on recent scientific research that has started to dismantle the idea that humans are savage and selfish, and it shows that this recent research shows that we're almost unique in our capacity for altruism and cooperation. So here we extend that thinking to suggest what this would mean for the way we design the built environment and the way we live. And we've been inspired in our thinking by the environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht's conception of the Symbiocene. That's a new era that we should strive towards to replace the idea of the Anthropocene. And moving away from dominant norms of competition and binary thinking that privileges either the government or the market, this chapter suggests a stronger role to be played by civil society and seeks to learn from the symbiotic practices of traditional cultures and First Nations. The final chapter we've called Possibilism and Expanded Agency. So to explain what possibilism is, consider for a moment that optimism and pessimism both imply a sense of inevitability about the future, and you either feel positive or negative about that. But a possibilist decides on the future they want and then sets about creating it. The term was actually coined by Hans Rosling, and what we've done in this chapter is we've put forward a much fuller description of what it means to be a possibilist. This chapter is deliberately building up to a kind of crescendo in the conclusion in which we hope to instill readers with a great sense of how change happens and their own capacity for bringing about that positive change. Back to Sarah now.
Thanks, Michael. One of the thoughts that inspired me the most when we were completing that final possibilism chapter comes from the American political strategist and organizer, Stacey Abrams, who was one of the many passionate and organized African-American women who brought about the change in the political orientation of Georgia in the last round. When she was asked on the eve of the high-stakes November 2020 US election whether she was feeling optimistic or pessimistic, Abrams replied, "I'm neither. I'm determined." So why should we be determined? Thanks to pioneering economists, including Kate Raworth, as Michael's mentioned, the economic dogma of endless growth is looking increasingly shaky. The harms of structural racism and the legacies of colonialism have been brought into wider debate for a new generation. Policy ideas like universal basic income, which only a short time ago were regarded as totally unrealistic, now look eminently sensible. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the flaws of macho leadership styles and may mark the end of human exceptionalism, the idea that humans can somehow exist outside the laws of physics and biology. So we believe that now is exactly the right moment to be maximizing our agency. I witnessed the 2008 global financial crisis from the helm of a civic-minded nonprofit organization struggling for its survival amidst policies of austerity. The aftermath of that crisis was unfortunately a missed opportunity for transformation because after the brief liminal period when change felt possible, those who were advocating for new solutions for various reasons were unable to get them implemented. We must not miss the transformative possibility of our present moment. The prospective recovery of the pandemic, layered atop the political shifts inherent in the imminent, today, change of administration in the world's largest, if admittedly severely dysfunctional economy, and the rise of China and its Asian neighbors. We believe that three factors are required to move towards action. Firstly, the new solutions must be clearly articulated. Secondly, the skills and support necessary to implement the solutions must be widely disseminated. And thirdly, we must see overwhelming public demand for change, rather than a passive reversion to the insufficiencies of the status quo ante. So we hope that our book can contribute to the bold new thinking that is required within our own domain of practice and serve as a source of inspiration and motivation for those professionals like you who've signed up to Construction Declares, your colleagues, your clients, your students, and beyond, as we all seek to expand our agency and our impact outwards. In writing this book, we've taken inspiration in the dual meanings of the word emergency. At firsthand, the word encompasses all the reasons for us to be alarmed: climate destabilization, biodiversity collapse, and the interrelated crises of inequality, racism, and sexism. All of the reasons we've already discussed why we must act urgently. Yet at the same time, the word acknowledges the many and diverse signs of change that we can see emerging on our own doorsteps and around the world if we only look for them. These offer great motivation to act on what's possible, with hope and with determination. So Flourish, which has been beautifully designed by the Italian-based studio Folder, will be published by Triarchy Press in the later half of this year. If you'd like to be updated about release dates and where to find a copy as soon as it's available, please leave us your contact via this link, which will also drop into the chat box. And now we very much look forward to discussion with Schirin and the audience.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Michael. I did not even need to be a timekeeper at all. You were so on the dot. Wonderful to hear about this book, and really, really looking forward to seeing it published. How's it going with the writing? Are you, is it, yeah, going well? So for people to sign up means that they will get an update and then hopefully hear about it when it's out in the market. Fantastic. Now, obviously, you've summarized the chapters. I had the privilege of reading a little bit more into like an abstract of some of these chapters, and it may go a little bit too far for the context of this webinar. But I think what would be fantastic is to have an idea how the different chapters are also going to be developed with regards to actionable items, so to speak. So the background to this question is that obviously what you're addressing here are really, I mean, it's in the title, right? It's really paradigm shifts. It's massive change. It is not, it's not a small thing. It's literally, Michael, you mentioned it. You're seeing this as an opportunity to go from Anthropocene to Symbiocene. So it's literally what you're demanding is humongous. So it's really something that typically happens every couple of million years in the history of the planet. So it is massive, a massive change. It's huge paradigm shifts that you're addressing, and you cover pretty much all aspects of human life. So you're touching on the political systems behind it. You're touching on the economic systems behind it, and all the way really to down to how we speak about these, how we speak about sustainability or regenerative architecture or life for that matter, and really all the way to really a change in attitude, a change in mental frame. And it's really a beautifully super disciplinary mashup of really tackling all that is at the root of the situation that we're finding us in. And so with this, almost redefining our self-image as human beings and redefining our relationship to nature, it's a ginormous task. So how do we reconcile that with the urgent need for action? How do we reconcile it with, at the end of the day, we are talking about an emergency where the images that you use with, 1 minute before midnight, there is a sense of, my goodness, we need to do something and we need to do it now. So how do we reconcile the without getting overwhelmed and paralyzing ourselves into inaction, the urgency and with the scale of the task at hand, and what can the readers maybe expect from your book in terms of, is there going to be a little bit of a what can you do on a Wednesday evening kind of first steps in the right direction, or how much can we hope for from your book?
Sarah, did you want to? Yeah.
That's a fantastic and really important question. I think one of the aims with the book has been that Michael and I have both been aware of and deeply inspired by colleagues or past thinkers, mostly contemporary colleagues in adjacent disciplines who we think have opened windows to fresh air on ways of thinking about the human condition in the world of economics and beyond, that we felt we were not hearing sufficiently discussed in our built environment conversations, and in a way to kind of flip the list of things that you shared on its head, but actually fundamentally, picking up on Richard Dawkins' original concept of memes, which I think has been really deeply diluted, unfortunately, by, in the sense of the Homer Simpson cartoon that goes around. His deeper intention of that term, of, these components with which we build our culture, inspired by the components with which biological life is built, that it actually is an actionable thing to think about the stories we tell ourselves that shape our behavior as professionals. And that I think we were both really moved and inspired by Jeremy Lent's work and thinking about metaphors and how the stories we tell ourselves shape the trajectories of cultures across history. And in particular, the idea of looking deeper into nature for sources of these new metaphors, because we believe that changing the frame will actually show us how to change the action in dialogue with others. But we are really conscious of the need to think about actionable examples, and have been, I know that in the research, we've been really positively impressed by what I mentioned at the end, and the concept of emergency, and in being able to pick up on all of these strands of things that are already being implemented in terms of creative thinking, in terms of possibilism, in terms of regenerative design, but that need to be amplified and move from being the exceptional case at the margins to being what we consider the very center of contemporary practice. Michael, would you like to add to that?
Yes, sure. Well, thanks for that, Sarah. One of the things that we've discussed, Sarah and I, is it's really important to be clear about where you ultimately want to end up. And that's why it's important to define these new paradigms, because that can start to influence all your actions, even if the actions are fairly small scale. As long as you're clear about where you ultimately want to end up, that is a useful starting point. We've also talked a lot amongst ourselves and in this book about how change happens, because I think that is slightly sort of overwhelming sometimes, as you alluded to, Schirin. And I think it's important to understand that all change starts in the imagination. It starts with someone or a group of people imagining a new way in which something could be, and then articulating that clearly. And as soon as that's been articulated clearly, that starts to change the reality. People start comparing the existing reality with that ideal. The next stage is to start implementing small versions of it and spreading the ideas until it grows. And what you can see historically is that sometimes there appears to be very slow levels of a slow pace of change, and then all of a sudden it reaches a tipping point and it changes very quickly. And we feel that that's what we need to bring about. We need to bring about a tipping point so that we can achieve these new paradigms in a really quite a short time scale.
What would that tipping point be? Like, does it translate into a major disaster, or do you see it as a positive tipping point?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to be induced by a disaster. It's really just a tipping point in people's thinking, the way they view a particular subject, whereby the old way of doing things all of a sudden starts to feel totally out of date and unacceptable in various forms.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you mentioned the you know, that thinking about the way that we talk about things as an actionable item. It's actually something that in practice we've come across recently a lot, is that really kind of telling the story. As you know, it sounds like such a banal thing to do, but telling the story right and explaining and bringing people along on the journey is really a fundamentally important part of
Sure.
the process.
If I could just add one more thing on tipping points, I think we're very close to a tipping point. If you look back historically, the last bastion of resistance is nearly always a certain demographic. It's of angry old white men who were trying to hang on to their sort of entitled privileges. And if you look at the people that were criticizing Greta Thunberg, it's exactly that demographic. They're the last people who are willing to criticize Greta Thunberg. And for me, that's a positive sign, actually, that we are about to get into this phase of a tipping point.
Mm-hmm.
And if you, picking up on that, if you look at global surveys of the two rising cohorts who will eventually be our voters, our leaders, they are all significantly more progressive than the preceding generations. And Michael and I have spoken a lot about how, and others too, about how the space that's being opened by young people putting their bodies on the line, you know, whether it's in the space of social justice or in the space of addressing the climate and biodiversity emergencies, they have opened the political space for those of us who are in positions of relative power. If you're on this call, you are already in a position of relative global power, I assure you. That they've opened the space for us to act. And this is our contribution to our small, modest contribution to that.
You just mentioned, you know, the encouraging signs, or you know, the signs for the tipping point with, you know, people taking action and across different demographic groups as well. As people, the two of you being, you know, on different continents right now, and each of you also being very active in different parts of the world, how would you gauge and how would you interpret the different levels of public engagement or sense of urgency? So one would think that, you know, being directly exposed to or a little bit more immediately exposed to the impact of our actions on the planet would, you know, trigger a response. So you mentioned earlier, Sarah, that the fires in Australia and in the US, for us here in Singapore as well, on a regular basis, being exposed to the haze from the region. There doesn't always seem to be a direct correlation, though. What is your take on the different levels of sense of emergency and engagement that you come across, if you do come across different levels of engagement at all, or maybe you say, no, actually we see it worldwide.
Do you want to go first, Sarah?
Yes. I think that those emergencies touching the people who have been shielded for the last 100+ years from the externalities of industrialized capitalism, through which we have benefited disproportionately, it's actually a good thing. And I have seen, I mean, living in Singapore for 7 years now, I do see a huge shift in terms of the public conversation around palm oil. The fact that people understood suddenly that many of these companies whose smallholders down the line had no other choice to support their families than to cause this horrible, you know, fatal smoke were actually publicly traded on the stock exchange here. And similarly, I think that it's all of these externalities that have been outsourced for so long to those who perhaps have traditionally had the least voice and platform, the fact that they're now touching those who do is fantastic. And that's again why we feel that this is the moment, that this is why we are approaching a tipping point. You know, there will be the 1% who think that they can hole up in their bunkers in New Zealand, but actually, you know, for those of us who are still relatively in positions of power to affect change, it suddenly, there's no theory to it anymore, right? There's nothing hypothetical about it or abstract about it anymore.
My sense is that there are quite big differences between different parts of the world in terms of sort of how ready for change they are. I think in the US, the existing sort of power systems still have such a strong hold on the way things operate. In the UK, I feel that we're much closer to quite dramatic change, and there was a moment of change when the Extinction Rebellion protests were on. That was when there was a fundamental shift in the way things were debated in the media. So we use this expression, the Overton window, to describe the sort of frame of topics that are considered discussable. You know, anything outside that is regarded just too extreme to contemplate. Now that frame fundamentally shifted in that period, and it brought about the declaration of a climate emergency by the UK government. So you know, I think there are positive signs that we can bring about quite rapid change.
And actually, I mean, the US is at a real crossroads, but Yale, the Yale School of Forestry or Public Health published the outcomes of a very recent survey last week, showing that significant majorities of Americans across political lines do support a massive, basically all of the points of the Green New Deal, but just not called that. So once things are reframed in terms of their tangible positive outcomes, there is support for that change. Obviously, you know, sitting here in Singapore, there's a much stronger historic trust in the government being the one who leads change. But I similarly, I mean, I would welcome others in Singapore who, if you want to contest this in the chat, but I in general have felt that I've seen an increasing amount of active engagement by government agencies and politicians wanting to engage with and help to slowly grow civil society. And I think that, again, young people have been absolutely pivotal in bringing that into the political conversation and raising general public imagination about what's possible.
Yeah, excellent. So again, a call to the young ones as well, to the younger generation in this chat, in this webinar. A call also to our students here again. I am a little bit mindful of the time because we promised we'd get to questions from our attendees as well, and I've blissfully ignored them. There's a beautiful one from Jessie Tan from Web, I reckon. Hi, I would. How would the ongoing growth in population and the apparent need for more resources be accommodated within a donut economic model? So, referring to one of the economic models that you're talking about in your book, where you know, maybe you want to explain it a little bit, but the question from Jessie is how does it, you know, how does it sit together with the fact that we're simply growing rapidly in population on the planet?
That's a good question, and that is an important issue, and is one that Kate Raworth addresses in her book, and actually in a very sort of positive way, because actually the trends are quite rapidly towards lowering levels of fertility and the lowering levels of reproductive fertility. The easiest way to accelerate that is actually to improve development and provide really good health and education facilities, particularly for women and girls. And that demographic transition from a very high number of births to a replacement level. That can actually happen very quickly. In Iran, it happened just in a matter of 15 years, mainly to do with the changing status of women.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think let's not get distracted by that. I think it can be a bit of a population can be a bit of a red herring sometimes, in that it ignores the historic and contemporary steep inequalities in terms of well, everything, but in particular, if we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, right? Who is actually causing the harm, right? And yes, we should absolutely, you know, the donut model is about raising standards and quality of life for all to an acceptable level, right? That's the inner part of the donut. But we also need to think about how we, in the wealthy world, think about, you know, our share of the problem. And also, I think one of the reasons why we've really embraced the idea of the Symbiosis and are trying to move paradigm away from the paradigm of competition is that actually there are some countries that are absolutely shrinking in population that would do incredibly well. It would be good for them and good for the people that they accepted, were they to open their arms and, you know, redefine what does it mean to be Japanese? How can we redefine our Japanese-ness that in a way that includes people who weren't born here? How can we redefine being South Korean? How can we even, you know, as Singaporeans, a multicultural society, how can we expand our narrative of multiculturalism to go beyond the four groups, you know, who were politically important at the time of the foundation of this government? So I think that there are so many other, it's real and it's important, but there are so many other ways that we can look at the situation from too.
I think the example that you mentioned, Michael, with the development of the birth rate in Iran is really interesting, because it's one of these beautiful examples of how everything is interconnected, and how sometimes one action triggers, you know, a follow-up action or a reaction that was completely not anticipated. That through the exclusion from women in many public life aspects, their education progressed drastically. So Iran has a better women quota in universities than Germany, for instance. And through that, like you say, that had a massive impact on population growth. And
just building on that, Schirin, a key reference for the Possibilism chapter is Project Drawdown, which, you know, it's number 8 or number 6 out of their 100 ways to get to the point of drawdown where we're actually reversing global climate emissions, is advancing the prospects of women and girls around the world. Yeah. It completely connects with what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Fantastic. There's one more question here in our chat, in the Q&A chat. It's a concept I'm maybe not entirely sure what it relates to. I would like to ask how design can achieve environmental congruency. I've come across many kind of notions. Is environmental congruency something that you've come across?
Well, I would interpret that as designing within planetary limits. And that is becoming increasingly obvious as something that we have to do. And it's absolutely doable. And we're increasingly seeing schools of architecture now teaching students how to do that. And, you know, the very essence of donut economics is getting our economy and therefore our built environment to work within planetary limits. That's how I would define designing for environmental congruency.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's about also, if it relates to chapter 2 of designing with nature, I would say that I see huge hope for that in more actively building interdisciplinary teams, right? We should all be working with ecologists. We should all be working with biologists. So we really understand, we can say, if the design you're talking about is architecture, you can really understand the nature of the site and the materials and the construction processes that you might be thinking about employing, with that much broader perspective of understanding of the natural world, understanding what was the ecology there before, what are the origins of the materials, et cetera, et cetera. So I think interdisciplinarity that hopefully can start at an educational level, but then would involve all of us actively building those stakeholders in at minimum as people that we can consult, but ideally as active parts of our design teams.
Mm.
And actually that's a strand that runs all the way through the book, the idea that we need to look deeply into nature to find the solutions we need in terms of rethinking what it means to be human, in terms of rethinking design, our relationships to the rest of the living world, in rethinking our economies and cities and so on. So finding the lessons in nature is a really crucial part of the challenge ahead.
Mm. Absolutely. One more a beautifully very concrete question. I started studying civil engineering last year and have a question concerning building materials. How do you think about a shift from established concrete building towards building with wood? Thanks anyway for inspiring talk. Might be a very pragmatic practitioner's question. I don't know whether you want to answer any of that or whether we follow up with the experts on the topic.
I think there's been a lot of fantastic research. I mean, I know that Harvard GSD were recently running a studio run by the engineer Hanif Kara, looking at structural timber. So I definitely refer you to their resources in the first instance, and I'm sure that that would open up a rabbit hole of many other resources. And Hanif is, I mean, if you feel like making an active approach, Hanif is one of the best cultivators of young talent I've ever met. Incredibly, despite all of his achievements, he's very approachable. Similarly, in Singapore, you of course have the wonderful folks who are co-hosting this talk. So I think reaching out to Web Structures, Web Earth, to discuss what their latest thinking is, I'd say reach out to the engineers who are at the forefront of this thinking. Michael?
Yeah, in chapter 1, we talk about the Gaia Hypothesis, which was initiated by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. And the idea with that is that the planet Earth has evolved into becoming like a self-regulating organism. It's actually a very complex nested set of systems. And it's pretty clear from looking back through the historical records on CO2 levels that there was actually a regulatory mechanism that controlled CO2 in the atmosphere. And it was marine microorganisms that captured CO2 and locked it up into rocks to reestablish the balance. And so one of the conclusions you could draw from that is that actually we should be making more stuff from atmospheric carbon. That's an important thing to do. And wood is one very good example of that. There are others as well. More and more now we're seeing products coming onto the market that are described as planet positive because they're actually made in a way that takes carbon out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, there are many different cladding products, but one I've seen in India recently that takes industrial soot out of the air. One of the most deadly forms of atmospheric carbon. Also, if you look at beyond simply wood, one of the projects we feature in the book is a project by Practice Architects built out of compressed hemp panels, grown in the vicinity of that building. So I think there's and they have an affiliated materials research initiative that grew out of that project. So I think there's so many wonderful ways for motivated students to tap into cutting edge work in this field.
We're unfortunately very nearly out of time, so I don't want to open a whole new big topic of discussion. Which is a pity, actually. There were still so many more to talk about, but I think coming to those examples that you just mentioned and the fact that you say, this will be featured in the book, I think that is a good key, because I think that will really add a whole other layer of information and making it a hell of a lot easier to also relate to the topics that you're discussing in the chapters. So I know that you didn't have a chance to elaborate on it today, but that there are some terrific examples for regenerative architecture that you will, I think that you plan on elaborating in the book, some of your own practice as well, Michael, and I think that will be really fascinating. Maybe in the next round, to talk a little bit more about, you know, the how it translates into into examples in the industry, which maybe leads us to closing with one last question here in our chat. Also very excited to read the book. When can we expect it?
As I mentioned earlier, it'll be the latter half of this year, but we're very close, and it's great to have the motivation of excited readers. Could I just add one point, which, you know, Michael raised the really important theme for us that's run through the research about looking deeper into nature. I think even one layer further upon that is actually, you know, referring back to Jeremy Lent's idea of seeing ourselves as part of a web of life, that actually rethinking the idea that we are separate from nature. And in that respect, I think that helps to frame why we are so interested in including examples from First Nations, in that at some point in our ancestors' previous ways of coexisting with the world, there was much less of a barrier between their sense of their capacity to collaborate with nature and see themselves as part of that web of life. So I think that's one further layer I would wish to add in closing.
A wonderful, wonderful closing statement, because it really captures how significant a change, a paradigm shift it is that you're tackling with your book. Thank you so much to the two of you. It was really, really fascinating, and I'm sure a discussion that we could continue for another couple of hours.
Well, thank you very much for involving us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Web, Hussein, Schirin, Woha, and also shout out to Ishian for helping us with our presentation materials as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Michael and Sarah and Schirin. There are so many other questions I see coming through. To those who've asked the questions that we haven't got the time to answer, we promise to put some of the answers that we can on the YouTube channel where the recording of this session is going to be uploaded. Look forward to active engagement and involvement by all here, and do please spread the good word, and let's help with overcoming the challenges that the planet and us with it are facing. Thank you very much indeed, and bye-bye, everyone.